I was trying to address mischaracterizations of Muslims and Islam in the Western media, which particularly portrayed them as violent. Zia's Islamization process hadn't really focused on the comprehensive and widespread impact on religious minorities specifically. A lot of scholars sort of asserted that Zia's Islamization had been influenced by Maulana Maududi, but I kind of felt that there wasn't much evidence that they provided to kind of support these assertions. Louis Althusser's theory of ideology as a framework, I wanted to show how Zia constructed an Islamic ideology of Pakistan, which he then sought to realize through the Islamization process. Basically, we need to answer two primary questions. The first is, what was the ruling ideology? And the second was, what is the dominant ideological state apparatus? And one particular example that I would give is that Zia gave an address to the nation on the 3rd of June 1980, and he said, and I quote, "Pakistan is an ideological state whose strength lies in its ideology and whose guardians are its people who are fully imbued with the spirit of patriotism." My name is Dr. Mary Hunter. I'm a visiting research fellow at the Centre for Strategic and Contemporary Research in Islamabad, primarily focused on the topic of decolonisation in UK-Pakistan relations. And this interest primarily evolved out of my PhD topic, which will be the subject of my talk today. So the doctoral thesis was entitled Contextualising Zia-ul-Haq's Islamization of Pakistan, 1977 to 88, and its impact on non-Muslims in the thought of Maududi and British colonialism. The main reason why I chose this topic is I started my research on Pakistan through my undergraduate dissertation. This focused on the Tariqi-Taliban Pakistan, but from a theological point of view. So ultimately, I was trying to address mischaracterizations of Muslims and Islam in the Western media, which particularly portrayed them as violent. So I took the actions and sayings of leaders of the TTP and showed how they were un-Islamic in comparison with Quranic statements on similar views. So when I decided to do my PhD topic, initially I was going to focus on the growth of so-called Islamic fundamentalism, Zia-ul-Haq, and this was because we can see that a number of the leaders of militant groups in Pakistan were involved as mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan war. But ultimately, I decided, because a lot of focus on Pakistan in academia is on security and terrorist-related issues, I decided instead to focus on Zia's domestic Islamization process. And having studied the literature, I found that there were kind of three main research gaps that I wanted to fill through my thesis. The first was that I wanted to approach the topic through a theological point of view. And this was primarily because of my own theological background, but also because I felt that a lot of the scholars who wrote on Zia's Islamization did so from a legal point of view, political science, international relations, and so on and so forth. And I think each discipline has something to add to the topic, so I wanted to complement these studies with an approach from a theological point of view. The second major gap was that those who had written on Zia's Islamization process hadn't really focused on the comprehensive and widespread impact on religious minorities specifically. So I decided this would be the main theme that I would focus on. And third and finally, a lot of scholars sort of asserted that Zia's Islamization had been influenced by Maulana Maududi, but I kind of felt that there wasn't much evidence that they provided to kind of support these assertions. So effectively, I wanted to try and test that hypothesis. Ultimately, the significance of this topic was that unfortunately we see quite a lot of antipathy and violence towards religious minorities in Pakistan today. And so I wanted to kind of understand this phenomenon and the relevant dynamics in the context of theology and colonial legacies. So in my doctoral thesis, I was seeking to make 4 kind of primary arguments. The first is that by using Louis Althusser's theory of ideology as a framework, I wanted to show how Zia constructed an Islamic ideology of Pakistan, which he then sought to realize through the Islamization process. The second argument was that we can understand Zia's Islamization, but also steps towards Islamization prior to Zia, better within the context of Maududi's theological ideas. Ultimately, I suggest, however, that Zia did sometimes depart from Maududi's. Ultimately, while he resisted colonialism rhetorically, his regime also perpetuated colonial thought and practice. So again, we have these contradictions. My fourth major argument is that Zia's Islamization of Pakistan did have a lasting impact on the country's religious minorities, as some scholars have tried to underplay the impact of Zia's Islamization. So moving on to my first major argument, this was that by applying Louis Althusser's theory of ideology, we can understand how Zia sought to realize an Islamic ideology through the Islamization process. So this theory of ideology comes from Althusser's book, Essays on Ideology, written in the context of 1960s Europe. And ultimately, this theory is based on what he calls a revised Marxist conception of society. So the Marxist conception of society refers to society as being made of 2 primary levels. You have the infrastructure at the bottom, which is the economic base of productive forces. And then above that, you have the superstructure, or the state apparatus, which includes the government, the police, and the courts. And ultimately, this state apparatus itself is consisting of 2 levels. You've got the politico-legal and then the ideological. So while the effectiveness of the superstructure, the state apparatus, relies itself on the effectiveness of the infrastructure, because that's the productive forces, ultimately, the Marxists conceive the state apparatus as being repressive, insofar as it enables the ruling class to dominate over and above the working classes. But this theory is called a revised Marxist conception of society because Althusser sought to make a distinction between state apparatus on the one hand and then ideological state apparatus on the other. Generally, in the context of then 1960s Europe, Althusser would have suggested that the state apparatus was primarily a public thing and ideological state apparatus a private one. But of course, in the context of Zia's Pakistan, the public and private overlap. Ultimately, Althusser suggested that the state apparatus functions primarily by repression and secondarily by ideology, whereas in contrast, ideological state apparatus function primarily by ideology and then secondarily by repression. And the specific examples he gives, he suggests that there are 8 ideological state apparatus. These include the religious, the family, communications, trade union, legal, so on and so forth. So you can see how in the context of Europe, these would generally be seen as private phenomena, but obviously in the context of Pakistan, then what was generally seen as private is often public in this context. So Althusser believed that it was within these ideological state apparatuses that the ruling ideology, which was defined by the ruling class, would be realized. So also one of these ideological state apparatus would dominate over and above the others. So when we apply Althusser's theory of ideology as a framework to Zia, basically we need to answer 2 primary questions. The first is, what was the ruling ideology? And the second was, what is the dominant ideological state apparatus? So the first question, what was the ruling ideology? I answered this question by looking at what Zia said in his interviews and speeches, and also the sort of language that he used in reforming the laws and institutions. And it became clear to me that this ruling ideology was the Islamic ideology of Pakistan. And one particular example that I would give is that Zia gave an address to the nation on the 3rd of June 1980, and he says, and I quote, "Pakistan is an ideological state whose strength lies in its ideology and whose guardians are its people who are fully imbued with the spirit of patriotism. But the proof of our love for the Islamic ideology should not be a mere lip service, but should be reflected in our deeds. Not only I, but all the patriotic and Islam-loving people want that we should very soon see the Islamic principles and Islamic way of life enforced in all walks of life." End quote. So we can see with just this example how patriotism was associated with loyalty to Islamic principles. And Zia, unlike other people who sort of shy away from using this language of ideology, was quite open that he saw Pakistan as an ideological state based on the Islamic ideology. So then the second question we should be asking is, what is the dominant ideological state apparatus? And it's within this that the ruling ideology is realized. So in the context of Zia's Islamization, this is of course the religious, or more specifically the Islamic ideological state apparatus. And I understood this, as Althusser does, as the dominant ideological state apparatus over and above other apparatus. So particularly the legal, the educational, and the communications of the Council of Islamic Ideology. So every constitution had provided for the Council of Islamic Ideology, but under different names, and it was over time that more of its functions were added. But ultimately it was designed to advise on how to bring the laws into conformity with Islamic injunctions. Zia had felt that not enough progress had been made towards the Islamization of Pakistan. So this is why he put a lot of emphasis on the work of the council. Secondly, Zia also established the Federal Sharia Court in 1980. And this again was meant to allow the court to consider on petition whether or not a law was in keeping with Islamic injunctions or not. It also would be allowed to judge whether courts had ruled correctly on issues relating to the hudud ordinances. Thirdly, they also opened a Sharia faculty at Quaid-e-Azam University to look into Islamic law. So you can see with these examples how the distinctions between the religious and legal ideological state apparatus occurred through the Islamization process. I don't have time to go into loads of examples here, but Zia would also repeatedly refer to kind of the Islamic ideology of Pakistan throughout kind of educational reforms, and also with regards to censorship in the media as well. But ultimately, Zia's kind of references to the Islamic ideology of Pakistan were not only in the context of Islamization. Instead, he also used this term in order to preserve his undemocratic rule. And there are four primary examples that I used to show this. So when Zia first came to power through the coup in 1977, he then repeatedly talked about the importance of holding elections in order to replace the previous government. But ultimately, one of these elections that he called initially for October 1977, he suggested that actually these had to be postponed because he was awaiting for the creation of an environment in which, and I quote, "the ideology of Pakistan should be in the forefront," end quote. Secondly, with the 1984 referendum, scholars have sometimes asserted that this was the point at which Zia received a mandate from the people in order to continue with the Islamization process, but also continue as the president of the country. Ultimately, I suggest that this is a problematic analysis because there were effectively four questions in one, and I think saying yes to one doesn't necessarily mean saying yes to the others. So I would say it was not a very transparent way of conducting a referendum. But ultimately, the question itself equated the Islamization process with, and I quote, "the preservation of the ideology of Pakistan," end quote. So again, voting against Zia in the referendum, he was suggesting would be like voting against the ideology of Pakistan, and he was trying to associate his Islamization process with Pakistan's Islamic ideology. A third example was that Zia amended the Political Parties Act, and this was such that no political party could be formed that was, and I quote, prejudicial to the Islamic ideology, end quote, of Pakistan. So this then gave him control over which political parties were forming, and he could vaguely say that one should not because it's against the Islamic ideology of Pakistan, though of course we should be asking, what is this ideology? Fourth and finally, there was only one democratically elected government under Zia, which was Junaid's government in after the revival of the constitution. But ultimately, Zia would dismiss this government in 1988, and this was partly because, and I quote, "the integrity and ideology of Pakistan have been seriously endangered," end quote. So these are just some examples to show how Zia not only used this term Islamic ideology of Pakistan in the context of Islamization, but how he used it to preserve his undemocratic rule. So as mentioned, Zia also attempted to associate Islamization with Pakistan's ideological basis, and ultimately he also then tried to associate it with Jinnah as the founding father of Pakistan. In my view, is kind of engaged in a continuation of the spirit of the Objectives Resolution through the Provisional Constitution Order 1981. And this stated that Jinnah had declared Pakistan to be, and I quote, "a democratic state based on Islamic principles of social justice, which is reflected in the Objectives Resolution." However, the problem is that there is a fundamental theological difference between the message of the Objectives Resolution and Jinnah's ideology. The Objectives Resolution refers to sovereignty in Pakistan as belonging to God, whereas Jinnah said on the 11th of August 1947 in his inaugural presidential address to the Constituent Assembly that the legislator would be sovereign. So these kind of problematize Zia's attempts to associate the Islamization process and the Objectives Resolution with Jinnah, and thus Pakistan's ideological basis. But ultimately, we should be asking, what is this ideological basis of Pakistan? So when I was undertaking my research, I came to the conclusion that there were at least 3 potential ideological bases of Pakistan. And the natural place to begin is, of course, Jinnah's view as the leader of the Pakistan movement. But ultimately, what he believed in terms of his ideology did change over time. So if we look back to the justification for the Lahore Resolution in 1940, Jinnah articulated the two-nation theory. And this suggested that Muslims and Hindus could not evolve a common nationality. But then, in contrast, he articulated a much more secular ideology in his aforementioned August 1947 presidential address. And this is when he said that actually the distinctions between Muslims and Hindus should be forgotten, as well as the division of the past, and that all people would have equality of citizenship and religious freedom. Ultimately, I argue that Zia, his ideology was aligned with neither of these 2 views put forward by Jinnah, but instead it was Maududi who had more of a similar ideology. And in my understanding, Maududi was against the Pakistan movement as led by Jinnah and the Muslim League, and this was because he believed them to be inherently un-Islamic. So Maududi suggested that if Pakistan was not based on the sovereignty of God, then it would be now Pakistan or the land of the impure. So he believed that the lack or belief in the ideology of the state determines one's position and rights within the state, as he ultimately felt that Pakistan should be an Islamic state, and thus whether or not you were a Muslim defined which rights and positions that you were able to have. And this seems much more aligned with Zia than Zia's is with Jinnah's views.